right, everybody, I think we'll get started here. Thanks for coming. So my name's Kolya, he, him. I've been helping out with the People's Education Program, which is a collaboration between All Power Books and Midnight Books. And we wanted to put on this forum. We weren't sure how many people would show up. Now we know. If you're standing in the back, don't lock your knees. So this is week 1 of what's going to be an 8-week series. And each week is going to tackle a different theme, a different couple of articles, which will illustrate some of the many viewpoints that divide the left in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the idea of this forum is we've been getting a lot of people who are very new to politics coming to our book clubs, our group studies. And I think it's worth pointing out and acknowledging that there are very many leftist organizations that have different political perspectives. It's kind of obvious to people who show up for the first time to political actions that there's plenty of different organizations with seemingly very different views that don't like each other very much sometimes. So we wanted to give people a chance to really go through some of the key points of disagreement on the left. Not all of them, of course, but some of them. So that's the mission of this forum. We want to raise the level of understanding about leftist politics for people showing up to leftist spaces. This week's articles are firstly Tipping the Scales, Popular Power in the Age of Protest and Pandemic by Cameron Padraig from the Black Rose. My co-host Tito will be presenting that article. And then I will be presenting Without a Party We Have Nothing by Donald Parkinson of Cosmonaut magazine. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hey everybody, I'm Tito. I was asked to help with this installment of the discussion, present the Tipping the Scales article, and I'm sort of new to the project. I don't know if I'll be participating in any of the other 7 remaining weeks, but I'm stoked to be here. Otherwise, you can probably find a little bit more about what I'm involved in Southern California by following Pushing Down the Walls on Instagram. It's a political prisoner support organization, and that's actually how I met Gabe from Midnight Books. So.
Thanks, Tito. So I'm going to talk a little bit, give kind of a broad contextual introduction, and then I'm going to kick it over to Tito to introduce his article, then I'm going to present my article, and then we're going to have an open discussion. And I want to give as much time as possible for that with as many people as we have here today. And in fact, we may switch up the venue for the future weeks. We have access to different venues that have much bigger spaces. We didn't want to start there and have like 10 people show up to a 200-person room, but we might have to make that move. So follow All Power Books and Midnight Books on Instagram to get updates about whether the venue will change. So today we're facing massive global dilemmas, and these are reflected in our local conditions here in Los Angeles. These dilemmas include racism, imperialism, climate change, pandemic, poverty, mental illness. But how many of you on your way to this event forget about the major horrors of the world for a second, which we will talk about throughout this series. But just regarding mental illness, how many of you on the way here felt overwhelmed and stressed just based on your normal, dreary, everyday responsibilities under capitalism? Your losing battle with customer service at Spectrum, the relentless stress of car traffic, having no place to sit down and relax on LA's narrow sidewalks, the increasing food and gas prices with no promise of relief. The liberal political project has not addressed these problems and is in fact largely responsible for these problems. So if the liberals can't solve them, the fascists have a solution. All right, but what is our solution? There's currently no viable alternative to the liberal political project in the United States, even at the local level of politics. None emerged after the WTO protests of 1999, the Iraq War protests of 2003, the May Day protests of 2006, the Occupy movement of 2011, the Me Too movement, the George Floyd rebellion, and most recently the US-backed genocide in Gaza. What sort of alternative is needed? I think everyone here would agree we need a leftist politics. But what is that? And already there's going to be a lot of disagreement. But maybe enough of us would agree that we are at the very least talking about a class-independent politics, meaning independent of the capitalist class, that opposes all forms of systemic oppression. Despite some heroic efforts and some isolated successes, there is currently no leftist organization that speaks for a significant section of the oppressed and exploited population of this country, and that commands enough legitimacy to mount a serious challenge to the liberal project. And it's clear that something must be done about this. So this educational series is not meant to unify the left, not today, and probably not in 8 weeks either, but rather to clarify the fundamental debates that divide leftist forces in hopes of better understanding the conditions we face if we're interested in developing a more mature and a more serious political project, one that's grounded enough to understand where there are actual possibilities for tactical, strategic, or programmatic unity. And with that introduction, I'd like to pass it over to Tito, who's going to introduce the Black Rose article.
All right, thank you very much, Kolya. Can I get a show of hands of who actually, who has read the Tip in the Scales article, who had access to that beforehand? Okay, cool. A lot of folks. How about the other recommended reading? Great. Okay, awesome. So I want to start by clarifying that I am not a member of Black Rose, though I am an anarchist. Just to put that out there. So, to build off of the introduction that Kolya gave, the two introductions actually that Tipping the Scales article had identified kind of a moment where the left fell down. The most recent one, right? 2020, we had COVID, we had the George Floyd uprising, and in just a few short months, everything was recuperated by liberalism, by mainstream politics, and brutally repressed wherever those things didn't work. There are still people who, in feeling that swell of energy on the streets in 2020, still facing charges and doing time for honestly some things that probably a lot of us did in those heady months. And the 10,000-foot view, I guess, that the article takes is that to break through that pattern of co-optation and defeat, whenever the next moment comes, and this is a little bit of a paraphrase, we're required to develop our capacity for analysis and strategy. And that's broadly in agreement with the article that Kolya is going to present. You know, very broad, right? We should have the capacity to understand what's happening and maybe plot a step forward. Everybody can agree with that. Or a lot of us in here, probably, right? The second, I guess, narrower version of the problem that's identified there is also that the anarchist movement specifically has been resistant to move beyond a position that's as simple as state and capital are bad, and has a stunted understanding of power, which leaves it really ill-prepared to enter into struggle against oppressive forms in a coherent way and an effective way. So from there it jumps off, at least as I read it, into kind of like a how-to or like a step-by-step mode that defines relevant concepts and gives like a coherent way of melding it together. I really recommend that everybody maybe who didn't raise their hand for the Tip in the Scale stuff, take a look at it. It's a short read, but there's bullet points, so you'll get through it real fast, which I always like. But yeah, it outlines power, which can be a spicy topic, especially for those of us who identify as anarchists, especially the more heady, in the 18 whatevers, like big beard days, right? Like there are a lot of folks who put together a lot of words about how all power is bad, and we have a reflexive way of understanding it that we shudder from it. I guess a lot of anarchists, especially those of us who spent our teenage years as like in a crass t-shirt. We were like jumping off from there, and then maybe read a little bit more around that and kind of filled in the gaps. And in one way or another, I think that beginning of the article is kind of speaking to that demographic. But there's power as capacity, which would be the ability of a social movement to flex where it is, right? To enter into a struggle and like pursue its interests. That's one form of power, like a collectivity of people who are contesting their ability to like perpetuate themselves wherever they are, or to just exist. That's one form of power, right? That's something that they felt was really important to communicate to the rest of us. Asymmetry in social relations, and that's how that power can fall down on you and hit you like a ton of bricks if you're not prepared or big enough, right? It uses the example of a group of feminists getting arrested at a sit-in and none of their demands being met. That would be kind of a demonstration of asymmetry in power. And then also power as mechanisms of social control and regulation. That would be like the police, or more abstractly, maybe we could throw in whiteness. That's what I thought when I was reading this article, this fluid and yet really rigid and consequential idea that isn't necessarily always enforced by violence, explicit violence, but can live in our heads and guide our actions. I felt like that was a very valuable intervention, I guess, to just put those things out there. Not mind-blowing, but they had a point in identifying a relationship to the concept of power that needs to be, dealt with, refined. I liked it very much, honestly. It kind of sounded like a YouTube unboxing because it is. I hadn't read this article before I was asked to participate, but there's some gems in there. Domination is related to power. They outline that as well. Relationships rooted in social, political, and economic institutions where dominant classes are structurally positioned to wield power at the expense of the dominated. So wherever power is set and become an institution, we can call that domination. That makes things easier, clearer to proceed. And popular power, which is their answer, right? The Black Rose position, as outlined in this piece, is that we need to build a version of power, or that the anarchist movement should be involved in developing social movements that can project themselves, that stay independent and autonomous and combative, and use direct action as a primary mode of struggle, and maintain, capacity for self-management, those kinds of things. You can look to probably the Los Angeles Tenants Union. Anybody here involved in that stuff? Okay, cool. Yeah, I've been lucky to go to some LATU events, and some of those local meetings can be really vibrant, and I can't imagine anybody jumping in and controlling it. It's like hard enough to take stacks sometimes when people get really fired up, and they get a lot done. So I don't know, just shout out to LATU for being so inspiring to me personally. That's what jumped up in my mind reading these definitions. I guess step 2, right, the advice Black Rose gives to us as anarchists would be to identify actors and sites of struggle. So actors of struggle would be people who have problems that immediately affect them. So a rent increase, a problem at work, things like that, versus people who are really passionate about animal rights. You're perhaps not an actor of struggle if you yourself are not a rabbit in a cage, but that's really what gets you going. And you can probably infer which of those Black Rose would think is the more important struggle to jump into, despite how you might feel about animal testing or factory farming. And the sites of struggle would be like a common place in society where these things are happening: the workplace, the university, schools, anywhere that the space is contested, right, between actors of struggle who are experiencing an asymmetry of power. Yeah, I reflected on that one a lot personally. I know I'm injecting a lot of myself in here because I did, kind of begin my journey in veganism and animal rights and stuff. So it was a tough one to pop up. I almost forgot myself a little bit, but here I am. And levels of organization, I guess this is like the meaty bits of what BRN, right, suggests for overcoming these moments of defeat, would be conceptualizing these struggles in like 3 tiers, right, using 3 tools to fight: the political organization, the social organization, and the intermediate organization. So the social organization I'm going to start with, because I feel like it makes more sense, would be anywhere or any place where the struggle's happening, right, where people with different interests but who are like overlapping in the material stuff, and they're fighting, right? So again, tenants union or a student organization. Maybe not everybody's all on the same page, but they've got the same issue. A group of Teamsters would be another good one. From there, I'd like to jump over to the political organization as defined by Black Rose. It's a place that brings together militants who share a common ideological perspective and political program. A high degree of tactical unity aimed at cultivating a militant minority. And if those 2 words together, I think, encapsulate what the Black Rose wants to be or is purporting to develop in the left: a militant minority. We actually quote another one of their papers, a self-referential thing here, which I felt was really, really useful, right? This is kind of what would differentiate the militant minority from a classic vanguard organization. The revolutionary organization should be a tool for the active and militant members of the class. It never seeks to dominate, impose upon, manipulate, command, or control mass movements in recognition of the need for revolutionary pluralism, and that those movements, not the revolutionary organization itself, are the revolutionary agent of social transformation. You should take a shot every time it's a revolutionary in that paragraph. To bring it down for word count, right, is the revolutionary organization, or Black Rose, say, if you joined it, would be a place to sharpen up your organizing skills and go back into these movements to keep them dynamic, independent, and powerful, and not a huddle where you map out next steps for the movement and plan out the struggle. Skills and go back into these movements to keep them dynamic, independent, and powerful, and not a huddle where you map out next steps for the movement and plan out the struggle from your independent poll of the most learned people. And that's from their position paper called Role of the Revolutionary Organization, if anyone wants to look that up. And yeah, the final tool that they hand us is the intermediate organization, which is a level that's explicitly there to develop militants who are dedicated to building social movements, like a place that's kind of like an incubator or a petri dish for learning and developing praxis. And they identify specifically a lot of the mutual aid projects that came out of the early pandemic, where neighbors were getting together to meet each other's needs independently outside of nonprofits and the state. And did anybody here participate in something like that? You know, handing out food, masks, hand sanitizer was a big one. Remember that when we couldn't get that? Yeah, exactly. You know, those either replicated charity, which, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, right? I can't fault anybody for trying to help. But they also can be places where we kind of practice meeting, trading ideas, and develop problem-solving skills as organizations. That's sort of what I thought, right, when they made that passing reference to mutual aid in the article. And when it concludes, it says that raw force can tip the scales briefly, right? That's a reference to all of the explosive energy that we saw during the uprising. But a permanent reordering of social relations requires long-term revolutionary strategy and organization. And I think in that long-term strategy and organization is being able to act on those definitions of power, finding actors of struggle to jump into, or to support in their sites of struggle. And yeah, that's their toolbox that they're trying to hand the movement. It's a piece that's very, almost like a DIY guide, but not, right? Like you need to be probably, it's guiding you towards Black Rose, of course. What's happening?
You're probably at time.
Yeah, okay, so that was tipping the scales. Yeah, hand it back over to Clay.
All right, thank you, Tito. I like that you had this firm grip on the mic. I didn't have that when I first started, so I'm gonna adopt that.
Ex like a punk guy brief.
Ah, you had some experience. Okay.
I was waiting for the chorus to. Never came.
Okay, yeah, and I didn't mention at the beginning the question of the party, or as the Black Rose article puts it, the militant minority. You know, what is the role of revolutionary leadership in the mass movement? I mean, that's the question we're talking about today. So this other article, Without a Party We Have Nothing, by Donald Parkinson, is really, it requires an analysis of two articles, unfortunately. He's responding to a different article, not the Black Rose article, but another article put forward by an anarchist perspective that I find much more frustrating than the Black Rose article. I would prefer to just respond to that article. I think it has a much clearer idea of what it's talking about. But we're going to address this interlocutor with the Without a Party We Have Nothing piece, which is an article by Taylor B., also available on Cosmonaut, called New Beginnings. And so Parkinson is responding to Taylor B.'s arguments. And these are Taylor B.'s arguments. I'm going to summarize them. Politics proceeds in a process of sequences, ruptures, and new sequences. And new sequences demand new forms of emancipatory politics, or the radical promise of each new point of rupture will be neutralized by forms of political movements, organizations that aren't appropriate to the moment. So, for example, the party. The party form, according to Taylor B., is an anachronistic form of politics, of emancipatory politics. The party was appropriate, he says, in Lenin's time, but that was a different sequence. Now we're in a new sequence that requires new forms of emancipatory politics. And so if we try to use the party today, the party will fail to deliver on the radicality of spontaneous social movements. And they give some examples. So the Stalinist state as a reaction to the revolutionary moment in Russia. They thought that was a neutralizing force. Once the party took state power, it became a neutralizing force on the radicality of that sequence. The Black Power movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, they think that political parties, whether liberal or radical, present neutralizing forces on such mass movements. Now, Taylor B. does acknowledge the universal contributions of Marx, such as a theory of capital, class struggle, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. So Taylor B. accepts that these are universal contributions to theory about revolution and how a revolution will look. But the party, it was particular to a unique historical conjuncture, namely the Russian Revolution. It no longer applies and is a conservative and conservatizing force in movements today. Now, Parkinson's counter-argument, I'm going to summarize, and then I'm going to give my own critique and elaboration on this. Responds to this idea of sequences. And he says that there are not neat sequences with beginnings and endings that you can clearly identify, but rather a historical process of both continuity and rupture, where elements of the old and new always combine to form unique conjunctures with both novel and familiar aspects. And, in fact, he argues, Lenin's party form was not at all a clean break from Marx. This is one of Taylor B's arguments, that the party that Lenin developed was a clean break from Marx's idea for a revolution. And I'm quoting now from the Parkinson article. Marx himself fought to form the Workers' Party in his own time and struggled within it for programmatic clarity. His own life was an example of the merger formula, which I'll define as the merging of socialism with the workers' movement, in practice. Kautsky, one of the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party who inspired Lenin, Kautsky was an avid Marxist. Kautsky merely systematized it and Lenin applied it to Russian conditions. So he's showing a continuity here between Marx and Lenin. There is no clean break, as Taylor B wants to assert. Now, Parkinson rightly acknowledges that it's tempting to place hope in the spontaneity of mass movements. And I think that anyone who participated in the 2020 uprising would have to admit that nobody saw it coming, and it was one of the most inspiring things that we've ever experienced as people who desire for revolution. And so the masses, I'm quoting again, uncorrupted, will bring a new sense of energy and vision into play and overcome the forces of the old, bringing the new politics of the genuine social movement to the fore. This is the temptation that Donald Parkinson believes Taylor B is falling into when he sees the explosive energy of the social movements. However, spontaneity is also not a new form of emancipatory politics. And Donald Parkinson cites debates between Marx and Bakunin, his contemporaries who were anarchists at the time, arguments by Rosa Luxemburg and Panakoic from over a century ago. And actually, we just completed a book club on What Is to Be Done, Lenin's 1902 polemic, in which he's critiquing this embrace of spontaneity that was emerging in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. And so to claim that the party form is anachronistic, but that spontaneity transcends history, I think is suspect. And I think that you would have to put into words why that's the case, which I don't think Taylor B does. Now, this is Donald Parkinson's key argument here. The left needs subjectivity to act, and the party merely represents that collective subjectivity. And I think the Black Rose article was good because it acknowledges, yes, the left needs subjectivity. We need to theorize and conceptualize a way to act collectively to realize the goals of our movements. And Parkinson would just take it further and say, that is the party. So I'm quoting again. To ask the strategic question of what is to be done, there needs to be a collective we that can act as a subject. Otherwise, we are simply acting as individuals, an affinity group, a nonprofit, or a temporary general assembly that will only last as long as people can stay in the streets. Quoting again, the party is not the imposition of an abstract historical model completely foreign to the conjuncture, as Taylor B claims. The call for a party is instead a call for strategy and the capacity to put it into practice through forming a political subject, a we that can pose and answer questions through collective action. So rather than being a figment or a transitory element of the Russian Revolution, the party answers the more elemental issue of subjectivity. It's not a unique form of emancipatory politics from some unique conjuncture. Furthermore, it's contradictory to say that we need humanity to take conscious control of the conditions of our existence. This is Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat, which Taylor B claims to embrace, yet reject any conscious planned effort, i.e. a party, to make this happen. Now, I think one of the stronger parts of Parkinson's article is he acknowledges some of the concerns about the party, and he addresses those. So yes, the party can be a neutralizing agent, whether it's a bourgeois party or a workers' party, that succumbs to petty bourgeois elements. And Taylor B's article talks a lot about this concern, that petty bourgeois elements can derail radical social movements. We saw this after George Floyd. All the demands for defunding the police, how many of them were met in any locality in the United States? We have more money for police, if anything. So petty bourgeois elements can derail and weaken our movements. But this happens to spontaneous movements, right? This isn't just a function of parties getting involved. This is just a fact of capitalist liberal hegemony. Liberal hegemony is everywhere. It's so much more powerful than any leftist logic. And all of our movements can fall prey to capitalist hegemony, capitalist ideas. The ruling ideas of any society are the ideas of the ruling class. This is one of Marx's original conceptions. And this is Parkinson's point, there is a class struggle within the party itself. The class struggle within the party must be waged to fend off potential muddling of leftist politics within the party, to push off and push away these petty bourgeois influences. So by conducting the struggle to control party bureaucracy and democratize its organizations, the proletariat itself protects the interests of the movement, the radical interests of the movement, and learns how to govern society as a class. So the party, and waging the class struggle within the party, fighting for proletarian leadership of the party, gives the working class an experience of what it will mean to govern society, the dictatorship of the proletariat. So those are the key arguments from the Donald Parkinson piece. I also wanted to bring in a couple of my own elaborations, and then we'll open it up for a discussion. Taylor B brings up this idea of conjuncture a lot. He's always talking about the conjuncture, each sequence is a new conjuncture, and we need new emancipatory forms of politics for this new, unique conjuncture. But the same old class struggle reappears in every new conjuncture, right? We have the ruling class and the working class who are engaged in a class struggle in each of these supposedly new conjunctures. So the key contradictions in society, the key social contradictions in society continue to reemerge. And so I think that's one of the further weaknesses of this idea that every new sequence is a new opportunity for unique forms of political organizing. The fact that the party has not emerged in the United States does not mean that the party is an anachronistic form of struggle. There are plenty of places where there are very powerful socialist parties that have serious hegemony over the political frameworks of their country. So for example, I'm just going to throw out one case, Bolivia. In Bolivia, there is a single socialist party that has the highest levels of power in society. They've rewritten the constitution. They've been in power since 2006. They've transformed Bolivian society from a neoliberal wreck to an aspirational socialist project. And they've done so putting anti-colonialism and anti-racism at the center of their struggle. And this is happening in the same contemporary moment as the failure of the United States left to constitute itself in any meaningful way. And so we have a party that's very vibrant and active in one particular context, and then we have the United States, which is at a very weak stage of the class struggle, which is, I think, another valid critique to make of the Taylor B claim that we're in a new sequence requiring new emancipatory tools. Okay, I think I want to leave it there and open it up to a discussion. Now, I think Tito's going to be our moderator, so I'll pass it over to him, but we do have discussion questions on the sheets that you've been given, and I think we'll go through those in order, and I would like anyone who wants to jump in and try to give an answer or a response to one of these questions.
Yeah, if anyone does not want to be filmed, please come up here and we'll make sure that you're out of frame.
Okay, yeah, so I think by now everybody's had a chance to sort of check out the bullet points at the end of the handout, and I guess I'll go in order. Is it possible to synthesize dual power and the intermediate level of political organization, of tipping the scales? And I'll elaborate on that a little bit. I think I was imagining the discussion going a little bit differently, but in the beginning of the article, the author, Drake, kind of describes dual power as we experienced it in 2020 as kind of this like mutualist thing that was divorced of its original Leninist definition, but then later on includes it in a definition of that intermediate level of political organization where we can kind of like spread our wings a little bit and learn. Is that a possible thing to do, or how do you reconcile the idea of struggling to build independent institutions that struggle in society versus the intermediate organization that Black Rose proposes? And any points of view on mutual aid fitting into political struggles would probably fit into this question pretty well if anybody wants to just riff on their experience doing that kind of work. Yes.
I wanted to highlight, with regard to the question, some of the difficulties within creating some of these intermediate social structures. and building dual power, because I do believe that these intermediate structures can project of any kind has probably run into some boundaries regarding handling resources, handling money, 501c3, LLC, anything with any staying power would need to conform to these rules that are imposed from the top down. So when the question being if it's possible, I think we would need to look at what is standing in the way of it. And one of the things that is standing in the way of the way this is the way the state defines legitimacy, and the way that those definitions of legitimacy can affect the staying power of well-intentioned radical projects. Those things are very difficult obstacles to overcome, and in trying to build some of these projects within collectives that I've been a part of, there are not a lot of good roadmaps for that. And I think it's important that we look at examples that are working, things that have been able to stay and last, and take notes and apply those going forward to figure out how we can make dual power possible.
Thank you both for your astute comments, comrades. I have 2 points that I'd like to try and tie together. In response to your question about mutual aid, I have seen it devolving into little more than charity, in no small part because it has failed to intervene along the typically long supply chains that define the current era of capitalism. Like neoliberal globalization over the past 30 years or so has, to no small extent, made a concerted effort to make proletarian organizing, the workers of the world uniting, if you will, all the more difficult. And so I think we do need to dedicate time and energy to identifying strategic points along various critical supply chains at which we can form alliances with progressive and revolutionary actors who can intervene where they stand. And this question of intervening where they stand relates to the question of land, which I wanted to pose to both of you. You know, when you were talking about sites of struggle and about places for appropriate and hopefully effective interventions, I was constantly thinking of the land question, because that has animated so many rebellions and outright revolutions across the world, especially but not exclusively in the global south over the past 500 years of capitalist modernity or so. And I think that we can't avoid the land question if we are to take building popular power through a party, through an anarchist affinity group, or any other form of revolutionary political organization seriously. To the extent that you do not exercise autonomy that includes autonomy over land, your revolutionary project is on a shaky footing from the get-go, and it can be quite easily toppled for that reason. I think you can see examples of this in the George Floyd Rebellion and in other rebellions that have occurred recently. And so I think we need to keep this key question of land in mind, along with the key question of labor, of course, as we build power from below. And I think that perhaps a vital shared responsibility, a common responsibility for all tendencies on the left is building basis. Whether you're a Marxist, an anarchist, an autonomist, or a radical of some other sort, you have to build a base wherever you can afford to do so. A base that addresses the question of labor and the question of land.
Yes.
I got a question for Hoyt, and when you're talking about like the party, it just seems really abstract. And so, like, I want you to talk about DSA or maybe Socialist Alternative or whatever sort of socialist party formations that we're seeing like actually right now, because you didn't address them, or I don't know if they were addressed in the article. And I can like see a lot of successes, I see a lot of failures, but I definitely know that institutional capacity for socialist party work is certainly a lot stronger than it was in the early 2000s and previously. And so I guess I'm kind of curious, like, is one thing that you're advocating is, do you think that like DSA is the venue that you think that socialist people on the left should organize within? And then like also how do you think about what they've been able to do, like how do you evaluate their successes and failures? And I guess like if you're trying to say they're not the venue, I'd like to hear maybe like that case. And so I just was hoping for a little bit more specifics on like actual party formation that we're seeing, at least within the last like temporary conjuncture.
That's a really good question, and I didn't point this out in my presentation, but this article in particular, "Without a Party We Have Nothing," makes clear that he's arguing not for a certain kind of party, but just, philosophically, for why a party needs to capture subjectivity in our movement. I would invite you to come next weekend, because we are going to be reading 2 more articles about what sort of party is needed. And another article from Cosmonaut magazine, which Donald Parkinson writes for, is called "Create a Mass Party." And in that article, the argument is put forward that we need a socialist party with programmatic unity, which does not exist in the United States. It doesn't exist in the DSA or any other organization. We have a lot of different parties with ideological unity, but they don't interface with other Marxists, other socialist parties through a program. And I think that, that invites really concrete discussions when we start talking about a program. And so if you're interested in that question, which I am very much, I would say come next Saturday, wherever we're going to be, and we'll discuss what sort of party is needed, because that is an absolutely crucial question. I agree.
Last round for the dual power intermediate level organization. Yes, comrade in the back.
Yeah, I have a question just for the same presenter, because you mentioned Bolivia, so I'm very interested in what broadly do you have in mind? I mean, from what I know, right, elections were obviously very key. So is that part of what you're thinking about? Is it the structure of their party? As far as I can tell, it's very mass oriented, the mass party. So I'm wondering if you could just expand on it, because obviously it's not just in Bolivia, but in many other Latin American countries, there's been a lot of triumphs in recent decades for the left. So yeah, if you could expand on that.
Well, I will answer that. I do want to invite more people to speak on, speak on any of these questions. We're already off book here. So, and respond directly to the arguments that you heard as well. I would love to hear people's interventions about the article Tito presented or the article Donald Parkinson presented. But I do want to respond to that, and I will, but I want to give a little bit more space for other people's particular ideas about the articles that were presented.
Yeah, just to echo, call you open fire, honestly. Yeah. But if not, to touch on one of the themes here in the Tip in the Scales article, what does cultivating a militant minority mean to y'all? When you hear that term, what pops up in your head? Because to the Black Rose, right? It's kind of like an anarchist university or like a training kind of a place, an enriching space to go back into your struggles. That considered, what do you wish you were better at? If you are organizing, or if you're barely getting your feet wet, what do you wish that you could learn? Or looking backwards, right? You're like a grizzled person who's seen some shit and been in the thing for some years. What would you say to your newer comrades, and what would you take them aside and try to show them in a comradely fashion? Anybody?
I've got something.
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay. I'm from a place where a lot of people that I know go to Rojava to cut their teeth and show how fucking badass they are. And one of the homies they came back and they were like, well, one thing I heard in Rojava is that I wish they had more therapists and less young people with guns trying to cut their teeth and show how badass they are. And I think especially when people enter into these movements, they enter with a very traditional, I'm mad, I'm gonna fight. The way to overturn power is to, shoot somebody. And I want to just say that one thing that I kind of wish I had known when I was younger, and one of the things that I wish I had been braver to speak up to my friends when I was younger, is hey, when you replicate state power in your own organizing, you are replicating the state. When you take the oppressor's tactics and use them as the predominant means to push your own agenda, revolution, etc., you're actually just kind of becoming the oppressor. And am I saying we can't speak the oppressor's language, we can't use the oppressor's tools? No, 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 we can. But if they're the predominant means of engagement that we have, killing people, creating our own cop squads, taking over neighborhoods, if those are our key methods, we're actually just the oppressor in a completely different jacket. And so I bring up the Rojava comment because I've seen so much burnout and I've seen so much addiction, I've seen so much harm, I've seen so much destruction come from this very aggressive-minded, this very revolution equals violence mindset that, I think this audience is pretty welcome to it, like caring for each other and loving for each other and making sure that we are healthy and making sure that our mental health and our physical health is centered in this is half the battle. Because I think about the divide and conquer strategies, I think about the tactics of cultural assimilation that have happened over thousands of years to many different communities and many different countries and many different populations. And one of the first things that colonizers or imperialists will do is they'll come into a community and they will destroy their religion, they will destroy their language, they will destroy their dance, they will destroy their culture, they will pass laws making such that these things cannot happen. And one of the things that's been so interesting about kind of following the Palestinian struggle lately is looking at all the different ways that people are mentally and emotionally surviving it, right? People are dancing a lot together, people are sharing food together, people are making sure that they still have spaces to have tea together. As much as they are under the most violent, extreme violent occupations, they are focusing on building, keeping their community intact. And I think that those focuses on mental resilience, community psychology, bonding, discussing these things is something that I wish were more central in organizing spaces. So many people want to learn how to stop the bleed, want to learn how to gauze a gunshot wound, but not everyone wants to create a community mental health circle, wants to create, just basic social bonding. And that's one thing that I kind of wanted to add as sort of like a necessary thing. Yeah, and it's been really interesting to watch folks be so open about their mental health as they're experiencing this occupation, I just think we can learn a lot from that because the resilience of that community is awe-inspiring. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in real quick because, the question of the state. Week 5, we're going to be asking the question, what is the state? Is the state just a tool of the ruling class to oppress the rest of society? Or is the state a tool that the working class can use? Or is the state more than just a tool of oppression? Okay, these are the questions we're going to be talking about in week 5. Again, I really encourage you to come join us for that and really get more into that topic.
Okay, I think we had a hand raised in the back there. Comrade, do you want to come take the mic, or are you comfortable shouting back there? Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I think this is a really thoughtful question, so thanks for raising it. And I think, both authors seem to, in my read, agree that there is a need for a militant minority, right? There is going to be the necessity of a deeply ideologically committed and high capacity group of organizers. But I think everyone agrees we're also not trying to just rely on that small circle, right? And so I think, that militant minority's responsibility is to be expanding that circle. And I think, good practices that I've seen are always asking people to do more, and more than once, right? And also providing people ways to build their skill and contribute, more so than just show up and mobilize and be counted, right? Yeah, I think in terms of the militant minority, I think that's a shared principle of both of these strains of philosophical thought. And I think it can be very mundane things. It's not just oh, come and march, but it's okay, maybe next time can you be a chant leader? Okay, and next time can you coordinate 5 more volunteers? And I think that people they're not given the responsibility to do more than show up and take orders, and I think that work can take a long time. And I don't think that means that there's not a need for a core of organizers, but they should be multiplying themselves, I think, is a successful militant minority.
Yeah, awesome, encouraging contributions. Definitely appreciate y'all expanding on the theme of how, I guess, the subject, right, the we of either the Workers' Party or the militant minority invests in itself to have a future, and that means engaging with each other as individuals and caring about one another. That's Yeah, really grateful for your the share and words. Honestly, very concise way to put it, and I'll be stealing the big ideas in the future.
Yeah, I really appreciate both of these articles for, putting a fine point. First of all, my name is Jess, they, them, there. I'm a member of the Freedom Socialist Party. Where I really appreciate the concise identifying of the differences between what is like an anarchist revolutionary organization versus a vanguard party. And I'm specifically looking at, that self-referenced quote in the Black Rose article. And I've got a couple of thoughts. One of the things that I wish that I would love to communicate to new comrades in the leftist scene is one, it's really easy to put yourself all in there and do all the marches and do all the things that feel right and to want to do a bunch of really big symbolic things. And what I've noticed is that people get burned out really fast when you don't have a clear program for what success looks like, because success, when we get swept up by these really inspirational movements like the George Floyd uprisings, and then they don't lead to the thing that we want, and we don't understand what a realistic pathway should have looked like, it gets really discouraging. So one, well, that's also tied into why I like the idea of a vanguard party. It's a space for me to brush up on my organizing skills and my theory, etc., but also a place to set expectations with my comrades for what our goals are in a space. How do we want to, agitate around our demands?
Thank you very much for that. So, I guess the way that I have seen this in practice, I guess, is the militant minority space, or the intentional anarchist organization, having the mission of sharpening up folks who are interested in reinforcing the combative qualities of social movements and helping them push in those directions wherever they are. I mean, there's definitely always room for analysis and strategy, right? I remember a long time ago I watched a really old documentary about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. Has anybody ever heard of them? Yeah, there's a great book out there called Detroit Idea Side of the Vanguard Party question that you're on. I really recommend everybody make some time to read it. And there's also on YouTube, it's a little low res, but check it out. It's a documentary based on them that was filmed by like a German group called Finally Got the News, or something like this, where they, like a Marxist-Leninist group, an avowedly Marxist-Leninist group, identify the auto-capitalism, like in world capitalism, and specifically black workers as a choke point within that choke point, like a place that could shut the whole thing down if it was organized and ready to move together all at once, and like in fighting for itself could bust open the dam of struggle. And they're not wrong, or I mean, shoot, it would be like really haughty for me to say that I disagree, right? Especially since they're describing a situation in the 70s, but they're making like a strategic intervention, thinking about tomorrow, right? They are there to make sure that group, that potential, they're going to add their analysis to unleash the potential. Where the Black Rose or a similar organization may differ, and again, this is just my perspective, would be a bit looser, right? Like the movement and the existence of the combativeness is the most strategic possible place to jump in, and the fact that these things are happening everywhere, that like struggles can be found everywhere, is in itself strategic, right? You could create a revolutionary situation sooner or later in the future by starting many fires across society. Figuratively speaking, maybe not. But it would make strategic choices, right, as a group. In preparing for the presentation, I listened to an interview with two Black Rose members on a podcast called It's Going Down. Some of you might be familiar with it. And, I had some thoughts, but they definitely, outline that they make choices about who they let join the organization based on what they're already struggling with. So, well, I have my thoughts about that, right? Like, it made it sound like they wouldn't let anybody in who's only been, rolling vegan burritos at Food Not Bombs. But they would be more eager to take somebody in who's already, like, in a tenant association or disgruntled in their teachers union. There's different ways to communicate that, but, like, it still reflects like a qualitatively different sort of like strategic choice versus having all the answers and knowing that you're pushing society in that direction versus like letting what already exists in society become more powerful and like, realize itself. If that's somewhat clear. Okay, all right, yeah. Buddy, yes, you sir.
So in my mind, there's a lot of similarities between the militant minority and the vanguard. I think first the problem I think is that there are a lot of militant minorities and there are a lot of vanguards and they're all competing. If you're a new activist and you're going out to a protest, you see banners for all kinds of different organizations. And you mentioned that they're very different, but it's actually pretty hard to tell where those differences are. They all say they want socialism or emancipatory future, but if you want to find out what those differences are, you have to go to some website and read, oh, we support all of the resolutions from the third Comintern, and you're like, what? I don't know. But they're all competing. They all have agreement, but they're all siloed off from each other. So there's no discussion. There's no debate between them. They all act like the other one doesn't exist. What's needed is, unity. That's what this is all about, left unity. And it has to be unity around, a set of demands that we want. That it's not a unity around ideology. We all agree that, the Soviet Union stopped being proletarian in 1919 or 1958 or, whatever that is. Instead, we want to overthrow the capitalist class. We want to take commands of the commanding heights of society. What instead we're doing is we're in these little groups. We're doing the same thing as the other groups. We're burning ourselves out because we're duplicating our efforts everywhere instead of coordinating, instead of debating. If we want to reach a higher level, if we want to analyze the current situation and determine what is to be done, the only way to do that is through debate, through different people believing different things, arguing and reaching a higher level through that argument. Instead of pretending like we all agree, silencing ourselves if we disagree because then we'll be kicked out, because there can't be any ideological differences, because that was passed down from Lenin or the ban on factions and some versions of history. So I think the militant minority and the vanguard both have the same issues.
And I wanted to jump in and address, maybe weave a thread through some of the themes that have come up here and some of the questions I was directly asked. One of the goals of the militant minority being to maintain the combativeness of the social movements. And I think this is one place where the Vanguard Party supporters, will say, distinguish themselves from the militant minority supporters. Because I think for the Vanguard Party, and this gets to the disagreement about the state. What is the state? The Vanguard Party supporters are not just trying to use direct action tactics, not just trying to stay militant, stay in the streets, keep the social movements aggressive, combative. The party is supposed to prepare the working class and its allies to take power over society, over all of society, to govern society. That's the dictatorship of the proletariat that Marx was talking about. And I think the party that sets itself out to do that is more of a vanguard Marxist party than, militant minorities that may be scattered in their forces, that may not unite around a program. And as the comrade just pointed out, what about all these sects, these, leftist, Marxist, so-called parties that each have their own ideological project? Well, I would say that they're actually closer to the militant minority than they are to the Vanguard Party. Because to take power over all of society, it makes sense to have one socialist party that's trying to accomplish this fact. And that has been the project that succeeded in countries where there were successful revolutions, is there was one socialist party that united around a program, not a specific ideology. And to bring in a little bit of psychoanalysis here, I think the socialist sect today is a bit of a neurotic response to the decline of the socialist project in the United States. It's safer to be in a smaller organization where you know that everyone agrees with the same line, or they have to pretend to, than it is to compete for leadership over a national socialist project, where you have to actually debate and lose debates and suffer the consequences of having your line not succeed and still participate in this collaborative socialist effort. And I think we're very far from that in the United States. Again, part of the reason I wanted to help out with this left forum. It's neurotic in another way, which is to be in your own sect and have your own complete formula and analysis of the conjuncture and of the historical socialist struggle gives you a certain comfort that these are easy questions, that the answers to these questions that come up in these struggles are obvious, and our organization has the answers and everyone else is confused. When in fact, I think we need to have a little bit more of a sense of humor about how difficult these questions are. There's a reason why there are 1,000 different answers to the question of how do we face the current conjuncture in the United States where there's been capital flight, where we're in a multinational nation, where many different ethnicities are overlaid into different economic classes, different social formations, segregation in cities. How do you approach organizing a working class project in these very, very complicated conditions? What sort of party can be built when individualism is so rampant in the United States? This is not an easy question. And you can't build the party tomorrow in these conditions, even if you're interested in building the party. So I think just having an openness to the fact that we do not have the right answers to these questions in a lot of cases. And even if we do, we won't know why the answer is correct. I think just having that basis will get us to a point where we can have unity. Because we can recognize that we don't have the right answers necessarily, and that only by engaging in a debate about the concrete scenario that we're facing can we pretend that we might have an analysis worth putting into practice together.
To provide something of an instinctive response to the previous comrades' a well-taken point about left unity, or perhaps better articulated left solidarity, I adopt a rather straightforward line that some might consider simplistic, namely that our enemies, the fascists, the imperialists, the capitalists, don't distinguish between us. They lump all of us into the same category, and we, more specifically, belong to a category that they want to exterminate because we pose a legitimate threat to them. They will line all of us shoulder to shoulder against the wall to execute us. So perhaps we have a very palpable strategic interest in standing shoulder to shoulder with each other in the spirit of solidarity and fighting our common enemies before they come after us more than they have already done so. To go to the previous question that was raised about the party, the vanguard party versus the militant minority, I think we should be wary of making a false dichotomy between either the militant minority or the vanguard party and the undifferentiated masses. Like the masses of any given society, or of the world as a whole for that matter, are not undifferentiated among themselves. And that is why socialist organizations in various parts of the world, from India to Cuba to Venezuela, have developed forums for deliberation among their respective masses. If you look at the Left Democratic Front in Kerala, for instance, it draws upon the power from below of women's organizations, youth organizations, cultural organizations, anti-caste organizations, and so on and so forth. And so I think in extending our gaze beyond this bloody country and the global north as a whole, and engaging with struggles in other parts of the world that have been shaped by comparable, if not necessarily similar conditions, I think we can perhaps begin to identify concrete forms of intermediate revolutionary social organizations that will hold either a militant minority or the vanguard party accountable. I mean, this is why Gio Maher, like a renowned anti-fascist theorist and activist, wrote a book called We Created Chavez. It's about how the Bolivarian socialist project has actually been led from below by the collectives and communes that have been established through it, and that have, in many cases, corrected the state's line when it has made too many concessions to capitalism.
Can people hear me? I think I can project pretty well. Okay, cool. I actually kind of have a question that I wanted to pose, which was, I wonder if the lack of unity in leftist socialist spaces may be something to do with a lack of a clear program. Like, who has thought about and talked about, okay, so revolution and then what? Like, the West's entire empire is based upon oppression. The way we get our oil, the way we get our textiles, the way we get our food, at every level in the chain there is oppression. And then when we do an overthrow, the ruling class, and then what? Like, how do we feed people? How do we redistribute resources? And of course we can learn from previous revolutions, but each of those countries had a uniquely different, a different historical perspective from where they were in history and how much global power and global trade they had control of. So who has talked about the program of what a United States empire overthrow would look like? And I'm curious if that had some unity within it, then there would be more unity amidst the different socialist factions or socialist parties that are kind of spread about right now. I'm curious if anyone has thought about that or what people think about that.
Do you mean specifically in the United States context?
I think, yeah, I'm talking about specifically in the United States context.
Okay, so like
but I think the fall of the United States empire would precipitate the fall of many other capitalist empires.
I think it's important to keep an open mind towards, like, the United States is a massive place as far as, countries go, as far as regions go, so many different cultures within a nation. And I think it's important to consider a world where many worlds are possible, where there would not be a blanket platform necessarily to agree on. So federated models or models where regional autonomy can be maintained through specific communes and cooperatives from ground up levels can allow for regional shifts and differences in handling the needs of a specific area. Obviously, like here in Southern California, we have different needs than different areas of the country. So I think it would be a little bit difficult to have an overarching platform. But I think that there's a possibility to have a platform that addresses the need for autonomy at regional levels. And I think that that's something that could possibly be unified while also meeting a diverse array of needs.
To add to that, I was thinking of a text that came out in 2014, 2015. The organization that published it, I don't believe is functioning any longer, but it's called Burn Down the American Plantation. And it kind of synthesizes the two things, right? Like, it's a proposal for what tomorrow might look like, but it's very quick and dirty in order to allow for that pluralism, that regionalism. It offers bullet points and a program for like a very decentralized, communitarian approach to reorganizing society here in North America, and it uses basically the unfinished business of the emancipation of slaves and the end of the Civil War, like how that is unfinished, as a jumping off point to understand what America is and how we make America go away. That's kind of what it wants, and personally, I also would like no America. Anybody else?
Yankee go home.
Yeah, Yankee go home. Yeah. And that might require some of us to kill the Yankee in our head. That category is ever expanding.
I'm Val Carlson. I'm on with the Freedom Socialist Party here in Los Angeles, and I think it's important to take a look at the vanguard is not something outside of the class struggle. The vanguard party is basically workers who take on a division of labor within this movement to study history, learn what happened, what failed, so we don't have to repeat the same mistakes. When you're looking at the spontaneous thing, people come up with stuff, they try it, and we end up experiencing the same failures over and over again as much as we might experience some of the successes. So that's important. Lenin's work on what is to be done really lays this out, where he talks about at that time, many of the socialists were getting really excited about a militant labor movement and wanting to simply tail end that and be part of it. But Lenin points out that the labor struggle is really a reformist struggle within capitalism to take away more from the bosses. It doesn't change, it doesn't bring about the revolution. And so how do you get to the revolution? And that vanguard element, studying what's going on in the conditions around in all of people's situations and try to bring those struggles together to support the fight, in that time certainly of workers, peasants, religious minorities, everybody who was being absolutely clobbered by the Tsar, to bring that together. I think the Vanguard Party, because it does that, has the ability to help create that solidarity and analyze what we have in common so that we can organize around that. The other thing is that there's the assumption, in particularly some of the anarchist writings, that vanguard parties are domineering. Well, a real vanguard party is really completely opposite of the way capitalism organizes things. It's organized a democracy from the ground up, not in ad hoc councils that come and go with the movements like Occupy or something, but in really pulling things together in a way that essentially makes it possible for people to work together and combine our struggles and have that solidarity so that we can act in a much stronger mass movement.
Thanks, Val. I wanted to recommend an essay just in lieu of responding to the question about Bolivia. There's an essay called Citizenship and Democracy in Bolivia. It's actually written by the former vice president of Bolivia, which addresses the development of political subjectivity among the masses in Bolivia. The way that they once thought of themselves as just a labor movement making demands on the bosses, as Val pointed out, developing from that point to the point in the early 2000s of believing that they themselves were the legitimate authority in the country to determine their own conditions of existence in the country. It's a very, very good essay to address the question of how socialist consciousness was built in that country.
I think that one of the problems with growing mass movements is that vanguardism is too tied to Marxism-Leninism, and so people who aren't MLs are sort of afraid to be associated to that. And I'm a big fan of Lenin, but it's been really hard for me personally to talk about a party with my anarchist friends or my Maoist or just regular Marxist friends because it's too tied to Marxism-Leninism. I think that we should maybe work to talk about a party as if it's more of a big tent that can struggle with other sects of Marxism and leftism as well.
This question for you guys: do you think that, I think a lot of what we're talking about today is like the incoherence of the left, really? And I guess this is a pretty broad question because I'm an American. I'm going to organize in America. That's what I know, right? It's what's most immediate to me. And I guess my question is, do you think this incoherence, or as your psychoanalytical point you brought up, this kind of neuroticism is a failure to understand the capital formation, maybe specifically in America, that we're up against? Like, whenever I'm reading about labor struggles in the 19th century, or even the early part of the 20th century, like, the struggles that those activists or workers were involved in were much closer to the bone. Like, industrial capital is way easier to organize. Like, not easier in the sense that, like, you're gonna get shot or strafed by planes and stuff like that, but like, it's much more easy to identify what it is. And now that a lot of that capital formation has sort of migrated to other parts of the world, global south, where maybe you do see more coherent antagonisms to those capital formations. Here in America, like, I'm a software engineer, it is a diffused, like, working contingency. Like, trying to organize it is, like, really like herding cats. And so I think, like, I'm Marxist, like, my base politics are labor, so I'm always looking for opportunities to organize it there. That to answer this question on the sheet specifically, what could you be better at? It would be that. Like, and I guess the follow-up question would be like, are we in a period of self-deception that we're actually engaged in politics? Because all of us in here, many of us have probably been involved in some kind of mutual aid. And sometimes I have this nagging feeling that while mutual aid is a good per se, it's good to help people, it doesn't actually feel political sometimes. Like, I'm sure people in this room have done activist work or organizing for homeless people, and that feels like almost apolitical to me sometimes. Like, there is no power whatsoever, in my opinion, organizing it. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but as far as like advancing a political program, like, I get this sense sometimes that I'm deceiving myself that I'm actually doing politics, if that makes sense. So that's kind of just an open question for you guys.
I think that makes me think back to the Black Rose definition of actors of struggle, right? Are you somewhere where you're fighting for your interests, or is the thing that you're observing a place where people are trying to make a difference in their own material life? And some of that mutual aid type work, some organizations, I guess, without struggling with that question first, can just replicate social work and not social struggle. But you know, how do you avoid falling into that pitfall of kind of like immediately like addressing your own feelings, your own stress, anxiety, and experiencing the shit show of capitalism by like doing the first most easiest thing, right, which is like sharing a sandwich with somebody who doesn't have anything at all. It's difficult to not fall into that without expanding your definition of struggle or what a worker is even, right? Like, it's not all hard hats and leather aprons and hitting an anvil with a big hammer, right? Like, the working class is like varied, right? And made of everybody, right? It's difficult to know now because those industries have left, right? Like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers described in that documentary, right? That choke point is gone, or it's in other states, or it's not as militant anymore, right? Like, even moving a factory from Detroit to like Georgia has been huge, right? You can achieve the same thing as moving a factory to China or, you know, somewhere where even further away. That's probably the thing that I would suggest, is expanding the struggle and maybe having to realize that you're not in that classical, or the circumstances have changed, right? Like, we're not at the choke point anymore, but it's still worth fighting. And I think I saw a hand here.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that idea and say, you kind of framed it in terms of like, we are politically incoherent on the left and there's all this fragmentation. And like, I think a lot of that is rooted in like our highly individualistic culture. And we are so fragmented just as people, not even ideologically, we're just separated and living our own lives. So I think there is something to be said about literally anything that brings people together for like positive change. And I think like something that's coming to mind, maybe folks saw it this past week or something, it was on the internet, women talking about mycelium and how like mushrooms are formed and how there's like interconnectivity underground, and there's connections that are being made. And when we see a mushroom sprout out, I don't see mushrooms sprouting out very many places in Los Angeles, but the idea that when the right conditions are in place, the relationship's already there, and the integration of the people is already there. And so I think that's something that we shouldn't just like, even if it's not a direct like, we're meeting for this purpose and meeting this goal, like, we have to think more broadly in terms of like how power is built, people power. It's built by people coming together. And so I think there's a lot of different ways that that can happen. It doesn't have to always be a direct link from, point A to point B.
Insofar as there is a new moment in capital today, and I think that whatever differences there are, we still live in capitalism par excellence. Our lives are still completely subsumed by the exploitation of our labor for the extraction of value. But insofar as there is a difference, and it calls for a difference in the left as its counterpart, I think that this has to be a moment of non-sectarianism. That has to be what we make a break with from the past. And these questions of like whether you're a Maoist or a Trotskyist or something like these, I think, have to be completely disregarded as identity categories and reframed as strategic low focus points where even something like the question of the party or the question of participation in reformist institutions, like these have to be taken concretely as strategic questions that we approach with our full knowledge of the full entirety of our history and yet approach anew each time.
Yeah, so just again adding to the wave of comments on this really good question that was asked. I don't think we can do anything enough to affect social change on an individual level. At the end of the day, I think an organization is where the most change is going to be able to be affected. Yeah, so I mean, and this is, I love Lenin. We just read What Is to Be Done here over the last few weeks. And even to touch on like the auto workers union that you had brought up as well. I mean, this is why a party I think is extremely useful, because it sounds like to me, and I don't know too much, I haven't seen the documentary, and I really do want to see it. It sounds like in that instance that the organization of Marxists was actually doing something what we call in Marxist circles called adventurism. They were out ahead of the masses of people. Instead of organizing with them, they got too far ahead and ended up kind of leading them astray. And this is why What Is to Be Done is so good too, is because it talks about spontaneity and how revolutions, how spontaneous movements arise, like the George Floyd movement as well. And he stresses the importance of not, tailing. You need to build along with the masses, so it's not something that's divorced from, or it's something that ends up being perceived, I think, in a lot of circles on the left as being kind of authoritarian or wanting to impose an idea onto the masses. So again, just summing up, I think working together we're going to be able to achieve a lot more and feel a lot less desperate just being organized together.
I wanted to address the point that the comrade in the red had made about sort of identifying things like some of the mutual aid things as not being political, or like meeting these emergency needs as not being political. And I wanted to explain what I thought of that, which is sort of identifying the difference between proactive politics and reactive actions, and how sort of the temperature being turned up as economic conditions worsen overall for a majority of people causes us to spend a lot of time and spin a lot of wheels on these reactive measures, reacting to emergencies, reacting to COVID, reacting to shortages in hand sanitizer, reacting to people being evicted. And a lot of these struggles, which are incredibly valid, we should absolutely be doing these things. We should be helping people wherever we can and working with our neighbors to meet these needs, but also identifying that this is a tool of the ruling class, is distracting and preventing us from making the proactive steps to disarm them and dismantle them by keeping us very busy with emergencies. But I also wanted to connect it with what the comrade in the orange said, where these mutual aid spaces are also excellent places to meet and to make connections with each other. Some of the comrades that I've met who ended up being really excellent partners in more proactive projects, I met behind Food Not Bombs tables. And some of those spaces, while they are very reactive and are very much handling these emergencies and these, base needs as opposed to these far-reaching goals, they are excellent spaces with which to incubate some of these more forward-looking goals, more future-oriented goals, and find the people that you need to find in order to wake up and work towards those.
Okay, one thing that I want to add to that, and also just push back a little bit about the codification of 2020 as a spontaneous movement. I personally don't think it was spontaneous at all. I think if you actually look at the amount of organizing that goes into George Floyd happening, there are national, if not international, cells that have been building for years to create a level of public consciousness that led to what 2020 radicals call a spontaneous moment. I can't go too much into depth, but I know folks who were teaching mobile journalism to Black students going back 15 years before George Floyd. How all of us know that George Floyd was a problem? Because people, happened because people knew how to photograph the police, because people knew how to communicate on social media, and because people within the media knew how to push a message out so that people would react and would understand it. That's not spontaneous. That comes from years and years of education, of unifying, of communication networks, social consciousness building. And so I think when we think about these mutual aid cells, when we think about these, kind of day-to-day, quote, apolitical, themes, I just really want to push back on the fact that they are apolitical because, to speak for myself, me doing kind of things that I thought were maybe neutral was how I met the people who pulled me into things, and when people with whom I could break out of my own alienation and then grow ideas and then create that kind of network. And so like I said, also one of the things about George Floyd is George Floyd doesn't happen the way that it does if the COVID mutual aid networks don't exist. And the COVID mutual aid networks don't exist if the organizers of Charlottesville, of Standing Rock, of, Ferguson, Katrina, Occupy, et cetera, aren't sitting there waiting like, oh my God, all I can think about is what's next. One of the things that was so interesting to me at the beginning of 2020 when COVID started and the mutual aid networks came together is that it was like some fucking super group situation where someone would be like, oh, I'm a water protector, oh, I'm a Black Lives Matter activist. We all know about this radical organizing space, we just show up and then collect supplies. And then when George Floyd happens again through this coordinated media and communications networking that have been growing for years, the same way the on-the-ground mutual aid networks say, okay, cool, we got hella snacks, we got hella hand sanitizer, we got hella water. Let's bring them from the houses to the streets to provide that infrastructure. So again, I just kind of want to push back on this idea that these things were spontaneous because they were the result of so much organizing. And I just want to give credit to where that's due, because these intimate moments are what creates the social connections and the awareness for that appearance of spontaneity. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, so here you go.
Yeah, so many of these questions honestly have been addressed by the comments and the natural flow of the room. Like, in what ways are you an actor of struggle, right? I think we talked about that a little bit with the question about, engaging in mutual aid, especially specifically with on house folks, right? Like, how do we engage in the struggle in ways that aren't actually a way to eventually fool ourselves into thinking we're doing politics, but we're just surrendering politics, right? And I think there's an active way of doing that as well in going in the psych route and to, I guess, build off the comments of or the psychoanalysis, right? When you think you're at the apex of all the right answers, your tactical decisions are gonna flow from that. A book that I recommend that I always tell people that they're probably gonna hate because I really was very uncomfortable with it as well is a narco-nihilist text called "Blessed is the Flame." I do not identify with all my links that you can scan over there at the back table to a PDF of the book because I think it is a very interesting mirror to look at yourself in, right? This is, an introduction to resistance as it was built in the inside the concentration camp network in Germany during World War II. And it's written by a Jewish nihilist They're exploring the different tendencies and the different ways that people who were trapped in those hopeless conditions built resistance and built organizations, and kind of condemns the more organizational forms, right? And holds higher, right, the act of just resisting for its own sake, because there is no tomorrow, and kind of explores the concept of being held prisoner by the concept of the future, right? Like, are you struggling because you're protecting yourself from that harmful feeling of helplessness, or because you need to elevate yourself above how bad things really are? Are you cloaking yourself in like ideology or even structural forms to supersede that, or is what you're doing relevant to freedom? And it gets deeply psychological, right? It steps away from the we, from the subjectivity of the group, and even criticizes the group, right? Like groups have their own internal logic and their own will to survive, right? It's kind of abstract, but these forms perpetuate themselves. And when we're organizing as anarchists or otherwise, it's important, I think. I've gained a lot from asking myself these questions, right? Like, am I doing things to make myself more important, or to feel like I am understanding myself better, or am I actually adding something to a material struggle? So yeah.
Thanks. I just want to say, we started a little late, so I think we'll go another 10 minutes or so to get a last round of comments. Any hands back there?
So I think there were two great comments from comrades back here about the nature of work now maybe being different than in the era of like classical working class movements, factory workers, everything else. So I'll start from why is the working class a revolutionary factor in society? It's not because they can stop working, cease production. It's because they're separated from the means of production. They're forced to sell their labor to survive. And that separation and the force of being, or the need to sell your labor, means the only way to advance their interests is to form collective political organizations, or collective organizations like labor unions, parties. And what really makes the working class revolutionary is they're the majority of the society. Because we're the majority, the working class has to fight for democracy, the rule of the majority. And to be able to rule society, the working class has to learn how to behave democratically and make democratic decisions. That's where the party comes in. That's where the need of the party is. So a political program for the party has to be two things. One, a list of demands that would give the working class power over society. So that's political democracy. We don't live in a democracy. Everybody says we live in a democracy. We do not. There are many undemocratic features. There are some democratic features, but they're all controlled by minority controls, like the Senate, the Supreme Court. Real democracy is something much different. And the other part of the program is the vision of the future society, which can be summed up in from each according to their ability to each according to their need. But what happens, once the working class has control over society is a question that we can't answer. It's up to the working class and the democratic decisions they make. And that's not just on a local, regional, national level, but it's on a global level. We need a global party, which could be made up of an international of parties from all over the world. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
Okay. Any other interventions for the question? Oh, okay.
Padraig sort of talks about like the party form being, or no, excuse me, not Padraig. The person to whom the second article is referring talks about the party form being anachronistic, and we're sort of talking about ways in which like the organization of capital itself has changed dramatically, right? But I think the party form itself is accommodating to those changes if it's sort of conceived of differently, right? Like I think I just read that book by Jodi Dean, the Communist Horizon, right? And she talks about, if anything is anachronistic, it's the notion, it's like the proletariat as the signifier of sort of revolutionary consciousness, right? There can be a mass party, right? A party of the sort of the broadly dispossessed, which includes, of course, the working class. But I mean, yeah, defining it in terms of labor is increasingly problematic, as the person who's a software engineer points out, right? Like that's not an identity that has the same purchase, at least in in the U.S., right, in the heart of empire, that it once did. Yeah, so that's just a thought I've been having. I also, on a separate note, I wanted to ask you, Tito, because like the way these two texts are paired, we sort of have one that proceeds as sort of a general, like, hey, here's a defense of anarchism as a form, and then we have one that is very directly sort of responding to a defense of anarchism, right? But there's no sort of like defense of anarchism that is responding to that positive argument for the party format. I don't want to put you on the spot, but seeing as you're the moderator, and you also position yourself against, I don't want to say against, but you did make a point of saying you're not a member of Black Rose, right? And
Yeah.
I think certainly for me and hopefully for other people who are equally like unknowledgeable about sort of the sectarianism, I think that just sort of speaking to that distinction would be helpful.
Sure. Can I get the question again?
Oh, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm trying not to say, why are you an anarchist? No, but I do mean
that one I could answer.
And I don't mean that. I don't want that to read accusatorily at all. I think like, I guess yeah, because
Used to it.
the second article is very much proceeding from this. It's almost hostile towards anarchism in a way that we don't have the same critique of the party format in the sort of pro-anarchist text. So maybe you could offer that critique.
Yeah, but that was intentional. I wanted the last word with the article.
Yeah, no, of course. As is your right.
Well, I guess I could start by saying that the original article, the OP, if you will, the Tom Brady beginnings thing, also left me kind of shrugging and going like, okay, what? Like, I wasn't very like impressed. The conclusion was kind of like a non-starter or like a non-conclusion for me. And as an anarchist, right, like I prefer more programmatic stuff, honestly. And if anything, I guess it's almost like a sidestep of the question, right? Like, that's not me, that article. But it did remind me of this, which was I was going to bring up a little bit earlier, which is, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit here from this book, The Friends of Durruti Group, 1937 and 19. The CNT was utterly devoid of revolutionary theory. We did not have a concrete program. We have no idea where we were going. We had lyricism aplenty, but when all is said and done, we did not know what to do with our masses of workers or how to give substance to the popular effusion which erupted inside our organizations. By not knowing what to do, we handed the revolution, and this is, in reference to the Spanish Civil War, we handed the revolution to the bourgeoisie and the Marxists who support the farce of yesteryear. What is worse, we allowed the bourgeoisie a breathing space to return, to reform, and to behave as would a conqueror. Many of us kind of know how the Spanish Civil War ended, right? Spoiler alert, not great. Absent the references to the CNT and Marxism, right? That's kind of describing like it's almost like a hyperbole of what happened in 2020, right? Like, these folks ended up having to run for their lives, and honestly, some of them had to run to like other continents to just survive. That did not happen to us, right? We didn't really like experience a moment like this. And the Friends of Durruti Group, in that moment, trying to fight and survive, right, in these circumstances which were more like physically dangerous and more demanding probably than the 7 or 8 months of 2020 that we lived through, identified a lack of ideas, a lack of program as like the issue, and honestly also like had a very like a much more aggressive definition of power and how to engage with it, which was to take it, to as anarchists suppress other people because they were actively being killed, which is a spicy take, right? And yeah, so I kind of agree with a lot of the criticisms found in the Without a Party article.
there's ends, right, where it's like identifying a party that can like contest elections. That's obviously not where I'm coming from. Curious about it?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and I would recommend the book. There's also a link in all my links to the full PDF, but you can buy it from PM Press. Yeah, and I know we had another question, or we had some input over here.
I think it's important that we have these forums and these debates and discussions. I think it's also really important that we network and we share our experiences in various organizational forms with each other so that we can build and grow. I know that I've been a member in a couple different organizations that had different organizational structures. I was a part of an organization that did 100% consensus. It was an anarchist organization that I was a part of. We were doing mutual aid and training and stuff like that. We found with the 100% consensus structure that it began to feel very undemocratic, actually, because even though you want every single individual to be heard and every single individual's individual experiences to be accounted for and listened to, it wasn't really a good vehicle for progress because a lot couldn't be done. So, like, for example, we wanted to bring in a health clinic, but we needed 100% of the people within the organization to vote yes on that. And a couple people, like 2 or 3 out of the 30, voted no. And for fearing for reasons of suppression and police interference and stuff like that, which is fair. But to me, there's no revolution without risk, personal risk, self-sacrifice. And so with that, we couldn't get that done. So unfortunately, we ended up, actually that's where All Power Books came out of, was a sort of Marxist contingent of this anarchist group that we were all part of. And then to me, obviously this is what this debate is for, is to me a party is probably the most democratic thing that can be born out of a mass amount of people, because you really have to put your ideas to the test. Not only is a party, people, they think parties are super oppressive or this big thing. What is a party? Gosh. But it really is just the people, just like a union would. The party's only as strong and it only moves in the direction that the people that are a part of it move it in. And so being a part of a political party, you do have to put your ideas to the test and have it all, majority rule. And then within that, once the majority rules, you do have to submit to that majority rule. And so not only is being in a party or a vanguard self-sacrificing, it's also learning how to be humble and learning how to suppress your own desires to benefit the masses of the people. So obviously we're not to a point where a political party is the masses in America yet, but I always recommend being in organizations that practice this more democratic structure that we don't see. Because like you were saying, in America we don't have democracy. We do have this militant minority they are a militant minority that are a dictatorship of finance and corporations and stuff like that. So if we want to not be like the state, we should move into a political party where we have these debates or have these discussions. We do see mutual aid as a tactic, but it is not the end-all be-all strategy. And so always feel free to come in here. I think feel free to meet and mingle and hang out and learn from each other. And I would love to also learn, as a organizer here at All Power Books, to learn from your guys' experiences in various organizations like Food Not Bombs or different communist parties, anarchist groups, autonomous groups, things like that. I just think it's important that we keep these dialogues open. And so just the first step of all of you guys being here is so phenomenal. And it shows that we want unity and we want community. So I think that this is fantastic. And on that note, we're actually, there is going to be an organization fair on the 28th, I believe, of this month. So if you are an individual and you're looking for something to be held accountable to, because if you're an individual actor, it's going to feel extremely isolating and alienating to try to take on the beast of the United States of America. So we highly recommend joining an organization. You don't have to join a party. You don't have to, whatever. Everyone believes in you guys to make a decision that's right for you. So we have a couple different organizations that are going to be there. You can see where you fit. It's going to be at Matahia Books. That's over in El Monte. Thank you. And so yeah, join us on January 28th for the organization fair if you're not already in one. You can meet other organizers and learn from them as well.
Okay, thanks, Savannah. And then I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Tito for co-facilitating with me, and I'll see you guys next week.